We ready to go here? So it used to be you didn't have to think about security when you're writing a Ruby program. Well, guess what, pal? Times have changed. There's all sorts of bad people out there, and you got to know how to stop them. All right, I'm not going to do the entire talk as Sonny Crockett impression, sorry. So I am Tony Arcuri, or RbNaCl on Twitter. I work at Square on the information security team. And my talk today is about cryptography, and just want to encrypt something. How hard could it possibly be? The answer to this is definitely hard. So how hard is it? Well, today you're going to drink from the fire hose, and I'm going to show you exactly how hard it is. So quick itinerary here. We're going to talk about attacks. We're going to talk about how to defeat them using something called authenticated encryption. And then we're going to learn how to completely avoid all these problems by just letting cryptographers do all this stuff for us. So I think Ruby's traditionally been in a pretty bad situation when it comes to cryptography. And the main reason for this is the OpenSSL library has been the only game in town for quite some time. So I think we can change this. I think this is a fixable problem. But to do that, we really need to know how the hell does crypto actually work? So the answer to this is magic. But not really magic, it's actually just math. So there's two types of encryption ciphers I'm going to talk about today. And we'll show how one builds on the other. The first is called symmetric. So here we have Alice, who just wants to send a message to herself, or rather just put this message away in a box and lock it, and then she can use the key to open it again and get the original message out. The other is asymmetric, so Alice wants to send a message to Bob. Same idea here, she's going to put it in a box and lock it with one key, and then Bob magically has another key that lets him get the message out. So the big problem with encryption is it lies at the intersection of math and security. So like math is hard and security is hard, and when we put all these things together, especially when we're talking about doing this in a programming language where we have bugs, things are going to get pretty hard. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Cryptonomicon. So this is kind of the situation we're in, I think, in the Ruby world, that most of the encryption gems out there aren't designed by cryptographers. They're designed by sort of amateurish people who are trying to put everything together, but maybe just don't quite know how. So I'm going to go through all the attacks on symmetric crypto. Unfortunately, I don't think I have time to do asymmetric crypto, so I left a bunch of those attacks out. But guess what? It's even worse. So we're going to talk about AES today. AES is a symmetric encryption cipher. It's great. I would recommend you use AES, but sort of like aim away from face, read all instructions before proceeding kind of thing. So this is how AES works. It's a block cipher, so it works on fixed size blocks. So we're going to take a 16-byte piece of plain text, and we're going to use a key, which can either be 16, 24, or 32 bytes. You want to generate that randomly. And from that, we're going to get a 16-byte block of ciphertext. So that's all well and good. AES works great. There's just this little problem. How do we encrypt something that is larger than 16 bytes? Well, one solution to this, PHP decided to use a different so AES is derived from a cipher called Rindall. PHP shipped the version of Rindall with a 256-bit block size. So this is awesome. It's a completely non-standard version of AES that only PHP uses. So let's not do that. Let's figure out how to do this right. So the naive solution to this is to use something called ECB mode. So there's this guy here. He apparently couldn't find out how to do encryption with OpenSSL itself. So he went off and made his own gem. to encrypt stuff with ECB mode. You see there, yeah, see security notes, ECB mode only. Problem with ECB mode is it's really, really bad. So what ECB mode would have you do is just take all these blocks of plain text and encrypt them under the same key. So what's the problem with that? Well, it leaks information. So let's say this is our plain text we want to encrypt. If we run that through ECB mode, we get something that looks like this. So I think you can all see from this that this thing isn't very well encrypted. We can totally see what it is. So what's the solution to this? So we need to use a different block cipher mode of operation. Now, there's lots of these guys. We just kind of have to pick one. There's all sorts of various trade-offs. The one that people mostly settled on today is counter mode. So counter mode is fairly easy to understand, I think. It's sort of similar to a one-time pad. So what we're going to do is take a block cipher like AES and try to turn it into a stream cipher. So what we're going to do is effectively generate a bunch of pseudo-random numbers. So we feed in a nonce, which is some secret starting place, and a key, which is the same as what we were putting in before. And then there's this little counter, and every time we encrypt a block, it's just going to count it by 1. So what we're actually going to do is combine the nonce and the counter and encrypt that with AES, and what we're going to get is a little bit of pseudo-random pad for each part of the plain text. And for each of these pads, for each of these blocks, we're going to XOR the pad with the plain text, and that's going to give us our ciphertext. So if we go back to our little Ruby gem image here, what we're going to do is combine this with a pseudo-random pad, and what we're going to get is the ciphertext. So I hope you can see that little subtle change there. So this is actually encrypted right now. We can no longer see that gem. And now we're done. Success. We've attained confidentiality. Except problem, repeating nonces will leak information. So we can't ever use the same nonce and key. So the solution is just don't do that. So we've got another problem here. Support for counter mode in Ruby OpenSSL is SPOTTY. So unfortunately, we can't use sort of the industry best practices here. And what we're going to use is CBC mode. CBC mode is fine. There are a few small issues with it, but unfortunately, I don't have time to go into them. So next problem. Attacker, who we hand this message to, can manipulate it. This is something called malleability. So let's say our plain text is attack at dawn, and we encrypt that, and we have a ciphertext, and we hand that to an attacker. Let's say this attacker is able to guess what the plain text was. So what this attacker can then do is XOR part of the ciphertext with what he thinks the original plain text is, and then XOR that again with what he wants it to be. So what we get is this sort of like manipulated ciphertext. And now when we decrypt it, it gives us the wrong thing. This isn't what we expected it to be. So the solution to this is to use something called a message authentication code. When we combine this with an encryption cipher, what we get is something called authenticated encryption. So with a MAC, what we do is we take the message, and then we have a key. And when we combine the message and the key, we get this fixed length tag. So we know we have the right message when we take the same message and the same key, and then we get the MAC we expect. So once again, there's a whole lot of these. Like HBAC is the one I'm sure you've heard of, if you've heard of one of these. The others are somewhat less common. So now we have yet another problem. What order do we combine the encryption and the MAC? So there's effectively 3 ways to do this, and common internet tools have all sort of chosen their own different way. So the first is called MAC then encrypt. So this was used by SSL and TLS. So the idea is you take the plain text and you compute the MAC of the plain text, and then you sort of combine those together and encrypt both. Another way to do it is called encrypt then MAC. This is used by the IPsec protocol for so we have plain text. What we're going to do is encrypt it first, and then we're going to calculate the MAC of the ciphertext. So the third way, which is used by SSH, we take the plain text and we encrypt it. Then we get the ciphertext, and then we take the original plain text and we compute the MAC of that, and then we put the ciphertext and the MAC of the plain text together. So which of these sort of three standards or three approaches got right? Anybody want to take a guess which of these is actually the right way? None. There's actually a right answer. One of them did get it right. So the answer is encrypt then MAC used by IPsec. So why? What's wrong with these other methods? So SSL TLS, you might remember there's this attack called Beast. It's using something called a padding oracle. I didn't really go into how padding actually works, but it's how you deal with when your plain text isn't actually aligned to a block. So using Beast, they were able to get a little bit of information out of when it decrypts and it does this padding check, and you can tell if it got through the padding or not before it hit the MAC. So the solution TLS uses now is to make sure it always checks the MAC, even if the padding fails. So it's a little bit of a Band-Aid. Encrypt and MAC, used by SSH, is vulnerable to chosen ciphertext attacks. There's a fun little paper on this. Fortunately, the SSH protocol was extensible enough they managed to avoid, they managed to effectively fix this retroactively. So in review here, if we were trying to build our own authenticated encryption scheme, what we have so far, so we're using AES in CBC mode since Ruby OpenSSL doesn't support counter mode. We're going to do the IPsec thing and encrypt in MAC, and I chose HMAC. HMAC is really nice because it takes a lot of the sharp edges off of some of the other MACs. So what this actually ends up looking like is what's in Rails, the active support message encryptor. So this is definitely a cool thing to use if you just need to encrypt something and you're using Rails. It's definitely a way to go. So let's talk about what else could go wrong. Not done yet. So the next thing is timing attacks. So speaking of that active support message encryptor, it used to be vulnerable to these. So this is a patch by Coda Hail to implement a constant time comparison of the MAC. And the problem is if you don't do this, the attacker can use this sort of like infinitesimal timing information, especially if they're on the same LAN as you or on the same host, to just try to guess at the MAC a byte at a time. So you see before what it was doing was not equals. So the problem with not equals is it'll sort of fail fast and exit early as soon as it sees something that doesn't match. So by using the timing information off of that, an attacker can effectively guess the MAC a byte at a time. So the solution is all that nonsense you see down there at the bottom where they're doing XOR between the two bytes and doing OR equals and doing this over all the bytes and then looking at the actual value of the result. So this is all pretty crazy stuff, right? And we haven't even talked about pub key. So really, I don't think amateurs should be trying to put all this stuff together. Unfortunately, that's sort of been the state of the world in Ruby. So what can we do better? We can have more boring crypto constructs. So what qualifies as boring? Well, to do that, let's talk about what isn't boring. So this has been how most things have worked in the Ruby world. So OpenSSL is kind of a terrible library to begin with. And then pretty much every Ruby gem you see that deals with encryption just layers on a bunch of amateur code, trying to put all this stuff I just described to you together. And typically they'll get at least one thing wrong. So I'm not going to name any more names besides that fast AES gem because I think that one was just pretty crazy and dangerous. But pretty much every gem out there, if you go through and you try to look for all these things and make sure they got it all right, it will generally get something wrong. Oftentimes they will not use a MAC at all, so they'll just use encryption, and then an attacker can screw with your ciphertext. And then there's all sorts of other little things that they can get wrong, which I didn't even cover here. So the boring approach, in my opinion, is to use a crypto library written by cryptographers. And when I talk about a cryptographer, who am I talking about? And it isn't someone like me, right? Like, I'm a crypto enthusiast, but I'm not a cryptographer. I cannot design my own ciphers that will be secure yet. It's something I aspire to, maybe, but not quite yet. So what we really want is to bind to a library that was actually written by cryptographers, people who spend all their time thinking about these kinds of attacks. So I have written a library like this that is actually a FFI binding to an actual library written by cryptographers. So the name is unfortunately a little bit confusing. I call it RbNaCl, but you may also know there is Google Native Client. It isn't that. And there's also the NACL organization that in Japan that you might be familiar with. It isn't that. So this is a library by this guy, Dan Bernstein. You may know him for libraries like, or projects like QMail, DJB DNS, and Daemon Tools. And if you haven't been paying attention to him for the past decade or so, what he's really gone hardcore for is cryptography. So he has designed quite a few of his own ciphers and all sorts of algorithms, and created this NACL library, which is slowly gaining a little bit of popularity. And you see the URL down there. It's under the Cryptosphere organization /RbNaCl. So to make things even more confusing, this isn't actually binding to NACL. It's binding to a portable repackaging of NACL called libsodium. So the best description I've heard of this is it's de-Bernsteinized. A lot of people don't like DJB's build system, and it's kind of crazy because the way it works, once you built the library, it's completely non-relocatable. So you can't really package it as a binary for a distribution. So libsodium took NACL and added a standard automake style build system. So it's easy to install. It is in Mac ports, and you can install it with brew install libsodium. There are packages for various Linux distributions. Some of them you'll have to actually build yourself from source, but the basic work is there, and it's getting more and more widespread adoption. So NACL has many primitives. I'm only going to talk about two here. So these are the symmetric and asymmetric encryption I was referring to earlier. But it also has a ton of other stuff. So it has HMAC, it has digital signatures, it has all sorts of fun stuff for elliptic curve cryptography. So I definitely recommend checking it out. You can go to the RbNaCl wiki, and it has all the features listed out for you. So first I'm going to talk about the symmetric encryption primitive it provides. So this is authenticated symmetric encryption, and it is called secret box. This may be a little hard to see, but it should be fairly straightforward to follow, I hope. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a key that is the size of a secret box key. It's actually 32 bytes. So you get a random key, and that is using RbNaCl's own random number generation. On Unix-like operating systems, that pulls from dev-random, and on Windows it uses, I forget what it's called. Yeah, Windows. Anyway, it does work on Windows at least. So after we've done that, we're going to make a new secret box with the key. And then here's the fun part. We need to make a nonce. So this is just generating a random nonce of the secret box's nonce bytes length. There's also another feature in RbNaCl called random nonce box. I'll do all this stuff for you. The important part is a nonce is a single use value. So every time you encrypt something with this box, you need to make a new nonce. So it doesn't actually have to be random. It could just be a counter. The nice thing about it being random is it's long, so it's 24 bytes. So if you just do a random number every time, it's hard to screw up. You don't need to keep track of the state of how many nonces you've used. So after that, you hand the nonce and the message to the secret box. It'll make the ciphertext for you. And to decrypt it, you give the same nonce and the ciphertext, and it will decrypt. And behind the scenes, this is doing all that authenticated encryption stuff. So it's adding a MAC, it's checking it, and it's using encrypted MAC. And then down there at the bottom, you see if you try to open the box and something is wrong, either the nonce is wrong or the ciphertext has been corrupted, it'll raise an exception for you reliably. So this is using a couple algorithms designed by Dan Bernstein. So the encryption cipher is called xsalsa20, and the MAC is called poly1305. So probably right now you're thinking, what the hell is xsalsa20? Like, never heard of this. That can't be boring, right? So I think this is boring because it is a cipher that has sort of been standardized through this contest in Europe called eCrypt. And the goal of eCrypt is sort of like when there was the AES contest. They're trying to produce better stream ciphers. So the salsa20 cipher was one of 4 they selected for inclusion in what they call the eStream portfolio. I say this is boring because things have gotten very not boring in the cryptography world lately. So you may have heard NIST standardized a random number generator designed by the NSA called dual ECDRBG, and turns out that thing had a backdoor. So there are still open questions about the NIST elliptic curves as well, and whether or not they contain possible NSA backdoors. I mean, if you're asking me my layman's opinion, I'd say it's probably unlikely they backdoor the NIST elliptic curves, but it's hard to know, and I think the boring thing is to use ciphers that are beyond reproach. So to do asymmetric crypto using these same sort of primitives, we have this thing called box. And here is an example of how to use box. So this time we have to actually generate a random key. So this is using that elliptic curve stuff I was talking about earlier. I'll get into how that works a bit later. So we take a private key, and unlike RSA, with elliptic curves, we can calculate the public key from the private key. I think I spot typed it there. Awesome. Oh no. So yeah, so once we've done that, we have a public key, and you'll notice here when we make a new box, we're giving it both somebody else's public key and our private key. And the neat thing about this is it's performing something called mutual authentication. So all these boxes are based around a set of keys. It's who you're sending the message to and your private key. So that way, when somebody opens up the box, they'll know they got it from the right person. So we make a new box. They'll also have a box on the other side. It is effectively the same box, just computed from the reciprocal keys. So then after here, it's pretty straightforward, just like the symmetric crypto. So what we're going to do is make a nonce again. We have the message, and we're going to encrypt the message under that nonce and under that pair of keys. We get a ciphertext again, and then the person on the other side can open it. And once again, like before, if it has been tampered with, it will raise an exception. So box is built on the same primitives as secret box, so it's still using that Salsa 20 cipher in the Poly 1305 Mac. The main difference here is we're adding in a Diffie-Hellman function. So that is called curve 25519, and that is an elliptic curve algorithm designed by Dan Bernstein. So one of the big worries about elliptic curve cryptography, in addition to possible NSA tampering, has been patents. So DJB has designed this curve specifically to sidestep all the patents. It's pretty awesome. If you go to the website for it, he lists out the patent, and he lists out the prior art, basically saying this patent is bullshit anyway. But then he's like, here, I completely avoided that problem entirely. So really quick, here's how Diffie-Hellman works. So it's pretty simple. What we do is a thing called scalar multiplication. So we take Alice's private key and perform a scalar multiplication operation with Bob's public key, and we get a shared secret. And Bob is able to calculate the same secret by multiplying his private key by Alice's public key. So these two operations are sort of like a reflection of each other. So box works by taking that shared secret and using it to drive a symmetric key. And that's all I got. Keep it boring.